Hello guys, and welcome back to yet another video of John Drama Paints. And in this video guys, I want to go and teach you or show you more how I painted the black robes on the goblins. And if you got here because you saw some of the pictures that I did of earlier Gitz, you have seen that they have kind of a checkered pattern or a texture pattern on them. And in this video, I'll show you on this Git. I'm actually not sure what the name of this one is, how I did that. So first things first, this one was primed with a black primer by GW. So as always over the robes, I went over with a Chaos Black or Abaddon Black, it's called nowadays, base. And I'm going to define where I want the pattern now using a paint called Skaven Blight Dinge. So bear with me guys until I get a second camera so you can see what's going on my palette at all times. But for now, what you want to do here, you could maybe even skip this part if you get more familiar. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm actually just gonna see where my deepest shadows are. So this will actually be more or less the foundation for me to know where I need to paint the pattern on after this, because you can spend a lot of time doing it. Why I actually chose this technique is because it is actually quite a time saver. It's not very difficult and it's very time efficient, and I do like the effect that it provides. So by applying this method, hopefully after I show it to you in this video, you will be able to use it as well, and you will be very quickly be able to replicate it on your own minis. And of course you could do it with any color you want. Why I chose it for these miniatures, for the goblins or the Gitz, is because they have a lot of that black showing through. When I did it on the first one, I didn't know whether I was going to go, what color I was going for with the hoods, which right now are blue. But I guess you could do this with any color. And so because I wasn't sure, and actually painting black nice so that it actually looks like well painted black, in my experience is really not so easy. So I wanted to cheat a little bit by using this way, and as it turns out, a lot of people liked it. So here I'll aim to show you how I did that. I'll try to keep it a short video, so I'll show you here on the front side. Here, this catches a lot of light. You might not need to checker this or to add the pattern there, but it's always good to know. This is always an interesting point, because here, this point is pretty deep in the shadows. So adding too much there might make it a bit busy or draw attention to things that you actually want to remain as shadows, so that they provide contrast for your more prominent focal points. And here we already have the little campfire, and of course we'll have the face, and he is looking upward, so the bow will also draw some attention. Here you already have the arrows to balance that out, and on this side we have the mushroom. So I actually don't want too much attention to go toward that part of the robe, but leaving it entirely black is then it looks as if it got as if we forgot about it, which is also not true. So now we need to come up with a good solution or a good workaround. Of course we could do the pattern here or not at all and simply glaze over it or make it very dark. It's a difficult area to reach at the same time as well. Again, even if you make some mistakes here, of course, this is always true. The neater you are at any stage with whatever technique you're using, or almost any technique you're using, the easier it will be, very likely, at later stages. So here, the goal is not to be very neat per se. It's more about applying that base color, getting a feel of where we want that pattern to show. Let me just see if I can apply it correctly here. because even right now it looks a bit messy. Even if I would go over that and add a checker pattern, then that would fade, that would fall away or fall into the pattern as we continue. And what I mean with that, that would add to the textured effect. So I might leave it for now, just to see if I can illustrate it a bit later on. Again, I'm using Skaven Blight Dinge, and I'm using it straight over black. And as you can see, it doesn't take very well. It's because it's a layer paint and not a base paint. And it is my belief that Games Workshop has developed their system with base and layer paints, and right now there's a whole bunch of additional ones, but that they have the base paints, that they have a higher consistency, or they have more paint particles in them, so they give you better coverage. Whereas the layer paints are the opposite of that. Well, maybe not the exact opposite per se, but they are different in the sense that they are more translucent, so that if you apply them, there's a much higher chance, or if applied correctly, that you have some of the layer underneath still showing through. And that's actually a great system, because that will, by simply the type of paint that you're using, can help you to start create that blend already. So it's actually adds some nice assistance while blending. However, when we do this all by ourselves using different techniques, it actually becomes more of a nuisance at this point, because we actually want paints with better coverage. So with that being said, I already started with Skaven Blight Dinge, and I've done it so for all the Gitz so far, so it's not like it's a huge problem to do it this way. But if you wanted better coverage, you could opt to just mix some Baden Black and Mechanicus Standard Gray together to achieve a sort of similar tone. And this, because those are both base paints, so they have the better coverage, and if you mix them together, they will give you a similar tone like this with better coverage. Okay, you know what? Are we gonna go round? We'll go round. And there we go. So sometimes just hold your model and see what catches light. Of course, if you change the angle, that will differ again. But just to get an idea, you want to try and drag your highlights a little lower on the robes. What I haven't done with the Gitz yet, which we could do, I don't think it will be for this video, is weather them a bit at the bottom to add even more effect. I haven't done it because I think they are the models are busy. They are very. Well, this is of course not a very busy model, but a lot is happening already. Even though it's goblins are known, or for me they are known as static models. He has quite a dynamic pose. He's loosing an arrow and he's bent backwards. If he's just aimed, his arrows are almost falling out of his quiver. He has the campfire here, the shroom when we paint it. So there's already quite a lot happening. Of course, you can add any detail you want, but it's not, I don't think it's necessary to add it here. Some models, I would reconsider it and definitely sometimes add more details that I paint on myself, because without it, they become very, very bland models. And here it is debatable. I've heard people have different opinions about this one, or these archer goblins that come in the Shadespire box. I have to say I really like them. They are well sculpted, they're very dynamic. Of course, the whole range is very nice of the new Gitz. And there we go. As you also saw in my previous videos, you can make it very busy with the pattern, or not. You could actually apply it very selectively. And actually, if you check out my Zarbag, with him, I actually did the first one, where I was very selective, where I just didn't paint over large areas of the robe and just left it black. Of course, I blended some of these things a little bit, so it was a somewhat of a smooth transition. But really, if you examine it more closely, a lot of those parts are just left with a black base layer. And that is on his robe, so it's a very visible part of the model. But because it is alternated with fine detail work, it is more forgiving, and it still looks as if it was deliberately done like that. Well, I guess technically I did deliberately not paint it, but sometimes if you skip parts or if you leave them black, people might get the idea that you just were lazy or, well, whatever they might think of it. Very often something not so positive. But if you use it correctly and if you alternate it, then you can take away from that, or from that prevailing opinion, hopefully. There we go. You can just go over it a couple of times, just go around the model and see if you can add it. Since it's a layer paint, now the positive part is if you then go a little bit more towards the midpoint, you can already create a highlight even though you're using the same color, or I should say a blend. Again, it's not necessary to do so, but on the back I'm waiting for it to dry because they do need a couple of more layers before we can continue. So, and you see, this is just, these are very harsh lines. It's not very well approached or very smoothly blended in, because as I mentioned, that is not the goal of, or the prime reason why we are doing this. And as I also said, that's why I also maybe exaggerated a little bit, even if it's just to show you what I mean with kind of dissecting your work into different phases. I really hope that when I say that this is the part where we sketch, or that this is the part where we simply teach us ourselves about the model, so where the shadows are, where the color should be, where the highlights should move towards, that you can start to trust in that process and also care a little bit less about how neat you are in these steps. Because it is not so important. And by the way, even if in the end it turns out that we needed to be neater there, we're using thin down paint, so we can always go back and correct any mistakes. And very likely, or in all reality, very often I do, and I have to go back to fix some of the mistakes I've made earlier. But it's less frustrating if you did them more hastily and you know that you're gonna come back to it. Okay, and so with that said, guys, this is basically Skavenblight applied over a Baden Black. And again, I'm gonna zoom in for a second. As you can see, it's just roughly defining where we want the pattern to be. Now, if we take this as a starting point, the only point I'm worried about is here. I'm gonna correct that a little bit. There we go. So I do find it a bit rough, but we don't need to go higher. So I'm just gonna make a submix between black and Skavenblight Dinge. You don't need a lot of black, but you want it pretty dark. And again, a Baden Black is a base color, so it gives you a little bit of better coverage. But right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna smooth these transitions a little bit. And I said it's not necessary per se to do this, but since I do intend to enter these goblins in a competition a month from now, I do want to take every precaution and just take that extra step. But in all seriousness, this probably won't even matter, and you probably won't notice any difference if you skip this step. It's just my way of being a bit more careful. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going over the where the Skaven Blight Dinge meets the Chaos Black or the Abaddon Black. I keep saying Chaos Black. Is the spray is called Chaos Black? Wasn't the normal black called Chaos Black in the past as well? Anyway, what I was saying is where they meet, for example, Skaven Blight Dinge and Abaddon Black. I try to go over and apply some of the 1-1 mix, so to soften that transition a little bit. It's not the goal is again not to perfectly blend it together, but just to soften the transition slightly. As you can see, while painting, I just move my brush up and down as I go over it. That can create, if you do this for a while and you become a little bit proficient in it, it can help you with creating smoother blends, because you're kind of starting to feather a little bit, actually. And alternatively, it will create something of a more random pattern, and that is important because you want to try, because we're gonna go for a pattern in a little bit, but if a pattern is not your goal, you want to try to steer away from a lot of repetition in your brush strokes, because one of the things that are very easy to see for people, or for humans in general, are patterns. We are great at pattern recognition, and we are actually, generally speaking, not so great at creating randomness. So very often, more often than not, subconsciously, you will notice afterwards that there is some sort of pattern to your brush strokes. And if you can teach yourself to like wiggle your brush a little bit, especially in phases, here I went on with too much of it. Please never go over it with your finger. Why I'm doing it is because I have to because I decided to provide commentary for these videos while painting it, so it's difficult. Normally I would have a brush either in my mouth that I would quickly switch to if something like this happened. But since I don't have that here, I'll just do it with my fingers and provide you with a bad example. As I was saying, so we are great at pattern recognition as humans, generally speaking, and generally speaking, we are not so great at creating randomness. So keep that in mind. All right, this is already a bit more to my liking. Maybe here a little bit. Here it doesn't really matter because it is a kind of a hard edge, but you can add a little bit of that mix in there. Of course, we could spend a lot of time making this, all these transitions a bit smoother, but we'll glaze for that if we want to. All right, and with that, we get to the next step. So let's continue with applying the pattern. Okay, so now let's continue and start with the pattern that we're gonna put on. And for that, I'm gonna use Mechanica Standard Gray. And I'm gonna start right away and explain what I'm doing. So you wanna make a checkered pattern, or well, if this is the effect you're going for. So you're gonna wanna make axes. So we're gonna start with one plane. So let's start with this middle piece of the robe and draw them all to one side, parallel to each other. Then turn the model a bit and then turn all the others axes parallel from that angle to create that pattern. So essentially a very, very simple idea. So crucial here is that you have a sharp point on your brush. And why I use Mechanica Standard Gray is because it's a base paint. And why does that matter here? Because I don't, if I can avoid it, I want to have the lines take hold on the model with in one go. Because going over such fine detail a second time, especially if you make parallel lines close to each other, it can very quickly get very, very messy. So that's why I prefer using a base paint than a layer paint here, and I can advise you to do it as well. Here, you don't even have to go all the way. You can even fade it out a little bit, even in the pattern. That is actually nicer when it comes to the effect, or I like it better. I should phrase it like that. You can go all the way with the pattern, of course, that is entirely up to you. So you saw I did it like this, and I actually didn't consider my angle very well, because right now they are almost horizontal. So for me to get the pattern, I would have to go like this, and I want it to be accent, so I want to drag it down so there is more paint left at the bottom of the model where I lift my brush, so that the color is more strongly pronounced there than in the shadows. And you'll see here, actually, it's a good example of where I could have thought about this a little bit more before applying the paint, because this is not a favorable angle, because I'm working down here and I get very close to detail that I've already painted, so I need to be extra careful. Whereas if I would have considered this a little bit more before starting to apply the pattern, I could have saved myself that risk. But as you can see, this is essentially how you apply it. And now we continue to do this around the other parts as well. Yeah, I'm gonna go and try to do it the same though. This one is, we could get away with skipping it. Well, we can get a couple of lines in, so that's nice. Nice little fine detail. What I like to do is I'll always, or as a rule of thumb, go a bit lighter than I will actually would like it. Because usually, more towards the end, I like to glaze over it, just to soften it a little bit and bring it all together a little bit nicer. And especially with these dark robes, we want them to be like secondary details that people see when they evaluate your model. So we want them to kind of fall away into the robe. So they might be a bit brighter even than I want them at the end. Here you see I went over a part of it, and now I have to go over a connecting part. You might say, is that not difficult? Yes, that is at the very least suboptimal. So I'm going to look at how I did the lines and see if I can continue where I stopped with the earlier lines. Even if you don't do it exactly, usually it's pretty forgiving. So let's try it again and see if it is so forgiving as I just mentioned. And there we go. As you can see, they don't line up perfectly, but that's okay, right? Because the detail is fairly small. We're gonna glaze it together a little bit, and it is goblin rags. So also with that, knowing on what model you painted, at least I take it into consideration, and then I can decide, okay, so I'm gonna assume these goblin clothes, they've been torn and sewn back together, so irregularities are to be expected. So I think I can get away with it. If I was painting maybe like a noble elf dwarven cloak and I wanted to apply this pattern, I'd probably be much more careful to have it done very correctly. Here you see again, I should have thought about it a little bit more. I can actually just stop and turn it around, because I don't want to drag my, because this is actually the highlight pattern. I want to drag that away from my deeper shadows. onto the top of that knee. And as you can see, it's only a couple of minutes and already the robes are starting to take or to get a very nice effect. And really, what have we done? We've just added one color over a bottom black and started adding in the pattern that we want. Very, very easy. Here again, now I'm deliberately holding it like this because I want to drag it away from those shadows. And there we go. And with this, we'll go over the entire model. And with that, we have the robes of one goblin or one Git nearly finished. These points, these connecting points like here, they are important, but keep in mind that generally speaking, few people actually look at your model from this side. People will generally look at it from this angle or this angle. So you do want to have them line up somewhat, but if you have difficulties there, or if it's not entirely up to the standard you prefer, please keep in mind that my advice would be to be a little bit less critical about those points and maybe a bit more towards the open planes on the front or the back. And even between those two, I would advise to spend the most attention making sure that it is correct on the front. Because also between the front and the back of the model, generally speaking, people will spend more time looking at the front. One thing that you could opt for here, and I've done it on a couple of different Gits, is here I'm gonna use Mechanica Standard Gray all around, but you could go for even adding some more Dawnstone or something for on top of the knee to create that extra highlight. Maybe we'll do that more towards the end. We'll see, we'll see. Here, this one is always, as I said, it's not so important, but it does help. And sometimes it's very little effort to have them line up. Sometimes it's a lot of effort, but in this case, I think I can just... I'm gonna wash my brush off because I have the feeling that some of the paint was starting to get a little bit dry. It's always a good point to wash it off and load it up with some fresh paint. Make sure you have a sharp tip. I'm gonna draw these in a little bit longer. And what I'm doing now is actually because I drew the first couple and I dragged them from the existing ones, I'm actually judging where the other ones end and continue from there, because I know based on the first two lines what the parallel distance between them is. It's always a risky call, but it's small detail, so even if it doesn't align perfectly, it is not always very noticeable. And here we go. Drag this one down. This one as well. And there we go. It is starting to take shape. And really after this point, you've had the hardest parts. Because right now, we've done the hardest part. We've done the highlight, the knee here at the front, the thing at the back. And these parts, they're generally very easy. So I'll just quickly go over them. You'll also notice, well, here I'll try to fade it out a little bit towards the closer we get to the top. And I'll start at the bottom and move towards the top here, because I have then more and fresher paint on my brush. And by the time I get to the top and I want it to be less pronounced, there's also less of it on my brush. That is just a natural, a thing that will just more naturally help me. There's a lot of things to be said for doing it the other way around, but it's just what I went for. And as you see here, once you get the feel of it, then it can go pretty fast. Here you see I'm drawing the lines, and I'm doing it a little bit faster. I'm a little bit less concerned about having them aligned perfectly. Okay, and then, I missed that one. So here we did this part as well. These are very small checkers. Sometimes I actually like this size because it's actually visible that there are some that there's a pattern in it. With my Zarbag Mini, I try to be very careful in doing very small checkers, but in hindsight, I think I went too small, and it is actually too difficult to see from a little bit of a distance what's going on there. So I spend a lot of time, well, a lot. I spent quite some time on the detail. Still the same technique, so it's still pretty fast, but even for this technique, I spent a lot of time on it. And the end result is that it's really difficult to see. So sometimes it's better even to do it a little bit bigger. Here on this side, we might actually experience the same problem. So we'll make the parallel lines, the other lines, these ones a little bit bigger, and then that kind of negates some of the negative effects from it. All right, and then we go to the last part here. All right, guys, and with that, the pattern is finished. And in this part, let's finish off the robes by glazing them together a little bit and making the pattern a little bit less pronounced than it is right now. And for that, I have taken out this palette and put in some Skavenblight Dinge, and I'm just gonna add some water to it and create this Skavenblight Dinge into a glaze. So really, what you'd normally want to do is do about 1 to 6, 1 to 7, 1 to 8 parts paint to water, but really there's no big downside to how much water you add. Well, I guess the biggest downside is that if you add too much water, that'll just take you longer to glaze everything together. So I'll show you that here I added quite a lot of water compared to how much paint was in it. And what I'll do now is I have a paper towel right here, I have the model right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna load up some Skavenblight Dinge on my brush. Always make sure that you get the brunt of it off. And here you can always check by going over like your thumbnail or something like that and see there's barely any paint left. You'll see a little bit showing through, but it's barely anything that you can really see. And what I'll do then is I'll shade over it, or I'll glaze over it, and I'll drag it towards where the natural, or where we have left the shadows already. And you'll notice that in the beginning, you can even do a full coat at this point, just to make it a little bit less pronounced. But as a rule of thumb, it is a good idea to teach yourself to drag your glazes towards your shadow points. So, and with doing this, because it's a very thin layer of paint essentially, which is primarily water with a couple of pigments of paint in it that's gonna dry on your model, it's gonna leave like literally a glaze, like a thin, very thin layer of, in this case, Skavenblight Dinge on top of everything that's underneath it. So what that will do is that will darken everything that you apply it over. And in that way, you reduce the contrast between the brightest colors and the shadow colors. And in that way, you blend them together. So that is essentially what you do with a glaze. And you can do this, you can go over it as often as you want and make the pattern less pronounced, less visible to it than it is now. Let me just check one thing with the lighting, if I can adjust it a little bit. There we go. Maybe this helps a little. One thing to keep in mind is when it comes to glazing, it is important that you wait for the first layer to dry before you apply the next one. But already, here you can see it's just one glaze. I don't know if it shows very well on the video. The effect is becoming a little less pronounced, and by reducing the contrast between all the colors on the robe, you create the illusion that it's actually part of the robe, the texture, rather than painted on it. And it will then also, because the contrast is much less, be less pronounced and therefore draw less attention away from the other points where you want the attention to go. Here, we went pretty bright with the Mechanica Standard Gray because we applied it so strongly. So we might apply quite some glazes before we move on. Here you could also, at the beginning of the video we talked about maybe going lighter on the knee. You could still achieve that a similar effect, even though not as light as Dawnstone, by simply continuing to glaze over the other parts and at some point stopping to glaze over the top of the knee. With that, you're also gonna create it into a sort of highlight, but what you'll actually be doing is just making other parts darker. In between I did nothing else, so I just had the previous glazes dry, and now I'm just gonna go over it and actually show you that I'm gonna skip over the knee, I'm gonna steer away from the top of the knee and apply just a couple of more glazes towards the other areas. Glazing is a very, very satisfying technique to use, but you always want to make sure that you don't go too far. And with that, I mean, if you continue to glaze too long, at some point you're going to glaze together the pattern with the underlying colors to such a degree that you're not going to be able to see it anymore. So it's good to every couple of layers of glazes, still don't know how to pronounce it correctly, to put the model away and look at it a bit from a distance to see whether you still need those glazes or whether you could actually already stop. When implementing or using this technique, what is also very nice is that you can correct many mistakes, maybe not even mistakes, or maybe you can just fix certain parts that you forgot or didn't spend the time to blend together very nicely, since essentially we're blending things together through this way. All right, and with that being said, I'm just gonna talk a little bit until it's dry. You can blow on it to help speed up the drying process. And I'm gonna call him done for now. We could go a little bit more, and maybe I actually return and do that at later stages. But for now, I don't wanna make it too dark, because I also wanna see what the effect will be once the rest of the model is painted. But you can do it with any color, basically. In this case, we did it with black rose, but you could do it with any color. And now you know how to get this effect for your minis. So guys, I hope you learned something. And as always, let me know what you think. And if you missed something, or if you want to see tutorials on certain parts, please let me know. And I'll make sure to do that in next videos. Bye bye guys.